The original medicalized groups on the internet were listservs, which were basically emailing lists. You could also, however, respond, and your responses would go to everyone in the group. So this was the earliest prototypical support group phenomenon that developed online. The very first medicalized eating disorder support sites were conventional recovery focused. Over time, they became very intensely regulated in order to purportedly to minimize triggers, to cultivate a recovery atmosphere, a positive atmosphere, greatly restricting what people were allowed to discuss and how they were allowed to phrase what they discussed. This became really silencing and alienating for a lot of people who, keep in mind, have a very difficult time speaking out about their issue in the first place. So recovery sites did not help everyone. In about 97, we first see a documentation of diversion within the recovery sites of a group who wanted the support, but it just that approach was not working for them. And so they began to brainstorm and find an alternate path or an alternate approach to living with their eating disorders. And we call this a pre-proana phase online. In the pre-proana phase, we see things coinciding with the advent of internet communities. First, there were, AOL hometown groups, Yahoo clubs, which became Yahoo groups. We began to see a coalescence of like-minded individuals forming their own e-communities in which to gather information, support one another, feel less alone, raise awareness. The beginning of the ProAna movement was rather uneventful on the public scale. The sites were rather inconspicuous. Typically, the only individuals who would come across material like that was somebody who already had an ED. We didn't see this kind of mainstream gravitation toward communities designed for individuals suffering with EDs. When Oprah Winfrey did a show on ProAna in 2001, this really precipitated the first wave of abject horror of the masses, and things kind of snowballed from there. Since media attention came to the ProAna movement in 2001, there have been 3 main attempts, we are in the 3rd now, to expunge these communities and this content from the internet, specifically via social networking groups. And they have largely been unsuccessful. The condemnation efforts began with AOL and Yahoo. Many sites followed. Now we are seeing Facebook, Pinterest, Tumblr, all jumping on the anti-alternate approach bandwagon. In April of 2008, France formally criminalized ProAna sites. They made it a crime to own a ProAna site, and this crime was punishable by an exorbitant fine and also potential imprisonment. Did it work? No. What we've seen in all studies pertaining to the movement is that rather than be dispersed or mitigated, these groups migrate elsewhere because, regardless of persecution, there is obviously a very potent need for an alternative approach that people are willing to fight for and pay for. As a result, we saw the formation of communities on privately hosted servers. Despite mass condemnation, these communities have persevered, and as I've mentioned before, there's a good reason why, and that is that conventional recovery communities do not serve the needs of everyone. The largest complaints seen on recovery fora and other online communities are, one, the censorship is extreme. You have to watch what you say so much because you can't mention numbers, or you can't discuss behaviors, or you can't share negative thoughts that aren't amended enough that your fellow ED sufferers in recovery won't hopefully be triggered. And unfortunately, in trying to minimize triggers, it's become a very stifling, censoring, silencing environment where people who have a very difficult time speaking out in the first place, the isolating nature of EDs, the intense shame that many sufferers feel, precludes people from being comfortable to open their heart freely and speak anyway. Add to that the necessary social nuance communication found on recovery sites, and it just became a bit too much for a lot of people. Also, it is very rare for anybody to be 100% recovery focused, and as a result, those who weren't 100% on the side of let's get better totally, which is something that's a very rare phenomenon. Most people are conflicted throughout their journey to some degree. I found that there was there was a potential benefit to an alternate community without so many restrictions. The mass media condemnation and subsequent general public exposure to the ProAna movement has had both positive and negative effects. Learning about ProAna has precipitated two problems. One, individuals who are not ill but are drawn to those who are, allegedly with the intent to learn behaviors that will help them lose weight. And then the second population are those who for some reason have a positive affinity toward pathology and want to covet an eating disorder themselves. The origin of the anorexic situation comes from widespread media exposure of the ProAna movement. After that, we start seeing the copycat sites, the people who don't have EDs but wish they did, the people desperate to lose weight, hoping to learn something useful from people who have eating disorders, creating their own versions of sites. This is where the media fulfilled their own prophecy in creating that which they were afraid existed already before exposure. Probably the most damaging and worrisome adverse consequence of the media condemnation and persecution and censorship is the re-isolation of and subsequent detriment to isolated sufferers whose only means of support is reaching out through an alternative approach connection. This needs to be given very careful and very intense credence, because when one is to the point in their ED that they are isolated completely, forming any sort of social connection is extremely difficult. And for many individuals, membership on a ProAna site or another alternate approach site is their only means of communication, socialization, connection. The positive events which followed the first wave of condemnation across the board, we've seen a very positive, proactive approach in response to these things. Many changes have been implemented to make communities more web safe, I would say. Not all, but the majority of sites have taken steps to amend their presentation. Also, because of the media-created anorexia phenomenon, administrators and owners and bloggers have become quite vigilant in discerning between
an ideal membership candidate and one who would be best served elsewhere. And so there have been a lot of preventive measures, a lot of amendments, a lot of proactive decisions in order to restrict membership, to privatize. These steps were taken in order to protect both sides. There is this fear-mongering tactic that these individuals want to steal everyone's children and make them sick. If this were the case, we would not see private fora. We would not see screening upon new member applications. We would not see changes to the mission statement which indicate exactly who the community is for, i.e. individuals with certain ED. Research supports the fact that were somebody who wanted to cultivate an ED to arrive at a site like this, those with eating disorders react very passionately and very negatively to this advance. We see an extremely different dynamic than one might assume from the cover pages. Another positive of the widespread media attention is more academic and professional attention, which allowed for funding for research. We have now seen 2 phenomenal studies that discuss the actual impact of these sites. The Peebles and Wilson study at Stanford University that looked at 180 different sites, the first large-scale study that really looked into the impact of these sites. And secondly, which is actually earlier, Antonio A. Casilli and his team doing the Anemia study, which is entering another phase shortly here. Both of these things provided critical knowledge that has helped shed some authentic light on what's really going on, apart from simply mass media condemnation based on reactionary emotion rather than fact. There is some contention regarding the different waves of the ProAna movement among researchers. Predominantly 2 waves are recognized, the first obviously being when the movement began through about 2005 to 2007. Definitely by 2007, with the advent of social networking phenomenon like Facebook and all of that. Most accept that that was the second wave of the movement when things went from strictly internet-based to the advent of social networking sites where more and more people are communicating that way, and medicalized communities are no exception. In my opinion, however, I posit a third wave starting with social networking sites and differentiate between first and second before that. In my opinion, first wave goes through about 2004, following the first mass condemnation and maneuvers to delete, remove, expunge, and ban and prevent this content from the internet. So I think second wave are the sites that came to us following the first wave of persecution. And then third wave begins with the social networking site.